As Paula said, I'm a principal scientist in SEPA in the State of the Environment Unit, and I was the chair of the Editorial Group for the State of Environment Report for Scotland. I'm going to talk today mainly about the process and the lessons we learnt on going through that process, rather than about the details of Scotland's Environment Report. I'm very pleased to say the apocryphal headline of fogging channel continent cut off no longer applies, because the messages from the European Environment Agency show a remarkable degree of convergence with ours, despite the fact that both reports were written pretty much independently, or very limited contact between us beforehand. So looking at the report itself, just to give you some context of it, the State of Environment Report, as has been mentioned, is part of Scotland's Environment Web, and that's a very large project, and it aims really to be the gateway to everything you need to know about Scotland's environment. Very ambitious objective, but we thought if Europe can be objective with a 2050 objective, ambitious, we can be equally objective here. So it's trying to enable the public to get the information they need to help them understand the environment. A very important part of it that James alluded to, it's a very wide base of partners. So there are partners from across the usual suspects, I expect, those organisations in Scotland that deal primarily with the environment or have large links to the environment. You can also see, which is very important, we're trying to increase the links between the environment and areas such as health, and between the environment and areas such as conservation volunteering, or volunteering generally. So there's a much wider base than has been traditional with State of Environment reports, which tend to be very much focused on just the science. This is trying, the Environment Web is trying to make it a lot bigger than that. So really the Scotland's Environment Web itself is about trying to take people on this journey, I guess, from being informed. So the State of Environment report is a large part of getting people informed about the condition of the environment. There's the ability to, as Cathy mentioned, you can equally in the Scottish report, you can sort of get interactive, you can use the data, you can interrogate the data, trying to encourage people to some extent, to a large extent, to challenge what we've said, to enable them to feed back with queries they've got, questions and disagreements they have with the underlying data on which we base this report, and then ultimately to get people involved. So the lady, Mrs. Hawke from Tynebruch, was mentioning about community involvement. Part of the tools we're putting in here are things like a project finder that tries to connect people looking with work to improve their community with those who are offering opportunities or running organisations to try and encourage that. So really this is about taking people from being maybe passive or not interested ideally in the environment to start off with, moving them through to having an understanding, perhaps a passive understanding in the environment because we've said this is what the state is, and hopefully getting them on this trip through to actually interrogating it, thinking about it a bit further, drawing their own conclusions, in time getting involved, and then via things like citizen science, feeding those data back into the information section, into how we understand the environment. So I'm going to talk primarily about the report itself. I'll talk about the ethos of it, the structure, how we set it up, and very importantly, the contributors to it as well. So the ethos itself, we spent quite a long time discussing this with our editorial group. We want it to be engaging and receptive and accessible. We want people to be able to challenge it. I think the three things we kept coming back to is we want it to be trustworthy, evidence-based, and impartial. So we don't want to, we're trying not to preach to people. We're trying to present the information and allowing them, as far as possible, to draw their own conclusions. I can't really say we're trying not to preach to people, because in my accent I sound a bit like a vicar at the best of times, but we are trying not to preach to people. It's about trying to set it out so people can decide what they want to do with it. And again, great degree of convergence, Darwinian convergence here on the approach we're taking. So at the top of the whole report, if you like, you have an overall summary, a simplification, which moves down through these assessments of state, our 5-banded system of assessments, through to chapters on which the report's based. They can go into topics which are around 3,000 words, about 6 sides of A4, deliberately again try to keep them fairly short, fairly pithy. Through to that you can then access underlying those, the reports through the library, and ideally into the data. Now different topics and different pieces of data stop at different points in this process, but the ideal would be for everything to be able to say, well, this is the statement in the summary, and be able to follow that all the way back to the underlying data, and ideally to the raw data, again trying to be as open and transparent as possible, because some of these things are obviously subject to interpretations. There's no one right answer necessarily. We want to try and say, well, this is our assessment, but here are the data you can base your assessment on yourself. In terms of structure, part of that is part of the legacy of it as well. So in 2010, we started the State Environment Report, and we applied for the LIFE funding. In 2011, we were awarded the LIFE funding around then, and we did release then a first version, a first step towards a State of the Environment Report, which looked a bit like that. Now, we'd gone down a certain route with that. We did then fundamentally rethink it in about 2012, I think, but to some extent we were still slightly constrained by what we'd already done. But we worked through from that, and in 2014 we published the State of the Environment Report, and we updated or completely reviewed it. Another important thing is that from now on, what we're aiming to do is have the data that is in there. The aim is for that to be updated as and when the source data is refreshed. So, for instance, we produce Water Framework Directive classifications every year. The objective is that those classifications, when those are updated annually, that's then reflected in the report. So the text wouldn't necessarily change, but the data would change. And I think the key message is, as Paul was saying, that they're not likely to change over a short-term timescale, but we want people to be able to go to the State of Environment Report and trust that the data they find there is the most recent version. We haven't got there yet. I think there are all sorts of problems about getting refreshes and updates and all the rest of it, but that's the objective. Then the bigger review, which is when you fundamentally rethink how are we doing it, what's the evidence base, how do we want to derive our indicators, that would happen less frequently. Again, we set off with a lofty ambition of, I think, every other year we'd do that, and then having finished it, we lay down for a long time in a dark room and thought we're not looking at that for a few more years. And we need to think about the timing of that and when we link it up, before or after the European report, before or after other types of work. So we haven't yet pulled out when the next date is. So structuring I've mentioned, and again we had huge debates. I'll mention now we've got a really good editorial group that helped with a lot of these discussions, already were these discussions, there was no lead on it. And we discussed all sorts of ways by which you can brigade the environment. And we fully recognise, and I think we say in the report, the environment's obviously a continuum. There's no bit where water stops or where soil stops and water starts. One impact in one area obviously follows all the way through to every other aspect of the environment, to a society and to economy. So we looked at, but to make it comprehensible, to enable people to be able to go into it and access the data, we tried to think how the average user would want to look at this. And we thought people still, in our judgment, people still tended to think, the public tend to think of things as water or land or air. They tend, we think, to think in those silos. So we structured it around this. I think for the next version, we might look more at the ecosystem services approach. Hopefully by then I'll understand it, so by then we could probably be able to use it. So until then, I think we're sticking with this quite straightforward-ish way of assessing the environment. Within that, you've got these various then chapters, so a chapter on land, water, air, and within them again we break down these different topics. So for each of the water, land and air, you can say, well, what is it? What are we talking about? And we could talk about landscape, or we could talk about, whatever it is, wetlands or rocks, geology. Then we can say, what benefits do we get from the land? And we can broadly talk about those in terms of crops and livestock. We can talk about timber and forestry production. And then you can talk about the wildlife that is generally found on land, so farmland, mountains and uplands, woodlands, and you can expand these. The whole reason for doing this is that it's flexible. So if we think, well, actually there's another topic or another area that we should be putting in there, we might want to, or we do want to expand the wildlife to talk about urban wildlife specifically. There's a structure that allows us to put that in and rebuild it without any, hopefully, major grief entailed. Within each of these topics, then, you also have to structure the topics. And again, we looked at different ways of doing this. We looked at the ecosystem services approach, to how you break it down. But we went back to, in the end, pretty much a modified sort of DIPSA model, where you look at the drivers and the pressures, the state, the impacts, and the response to that. We did a slightly simplified way. We crunched it together. So state talks about state, pressures, and impacts. Again, in the 2011 version, we had an impacts section brought out separately, which talked about consequences. And then we thought, well, maybe that isn't helpful, and put it back in. And now we're thinking maybe it was helpful and we shouldn't have taken it out and we should have that separate. So all this will evolve, and it all depends very much on what the topic is you're talking about as to how it fits. So it might work differently for different topics. Then at the end, we talk about the response, so what's being done about it. And we try to make some assessment of how effective that response is being. But the main way we do that is through this state and trend assessment. It's interesting that, again, Paul and Kathy have mentioned this. It's fair to say this generated an awful lot of discussion, both with the editorial group and externally. There are arguments against doing this. It's obviously, the whole reason we're doing it is it's incredibly simplistic. By doing this, you lose a lot of the detail. You're averaging things. There are good reasons why this makes people nervous. But in the judgment of the editorial group, this is a good way of engaging with the public. It's a good way of engaging with policymakers because it's simple. So rather than give someone a 7-page diagram that sets out the condition of the environment, we're trying to distill it down. But we're trying to be very clear on where we haven't got evidence. We're trying to be very honest about the fact this is an expert judgment. This doesn't neatly map to X% of water bodies or rivers are in this condition or X% of land is like this. This is very much an expert judgment. And we've tried to be upfront about that and how unsure we are in some areas of it. So how we did that, we're very aware of trying to avoid bias in this. So we did it by getting individual experts, and we had around 109 experts, many of whom were in the room, I think, go out, and we gave them all a sort of questionnaire for each topic. So we'll talk about the state, how do you rank the state, what do you think the pressures are, what are the trends likely to be happening over in the future. We got those individual experts to carry this out, all independently, across partners, across academia, and then having done that, we brought all of those together. So we hoped by getting everyone to do it independently, they wouldn't be influencing each other, and the loudest person wouldn't be pushing someone down a particular route. We then brought people together on a phone conference for a couple of hours, and we did, I think I did 25, 30 of these, quite tiring. You have these discussions, which are really useful, and then you try and get to a consensus view at the end of it. I was dreading these. I went in thinking this is going to be just a car crash, there are going to be huge amounts of arguments, people falling out, it's just going to completely unravel, and amazingly it didn't. So all of them except for one group came to a consensus, and the group that didn't come to a consensus, it wasn't that far off, and I think both were happy with the final results that and the justification we put on it. So that was quite interesting, and I did expect this to be a lot more awkward than it was. And there's a very interesting paper written slightly worryingly by the CIA on the use of confirmation bias and bringing groups together about gathering intelligence. So that was quite good fun to read as well. So having got all of these, whatever it was, 30, 25 odd reviews together, the editorial group then reviewed them. And again, when we set this process up, we anticipated that when the editorial group reviewed it, we'd have to make lots of decisions and bang people's heads together. And again, there was actually nothing for us to do here. They'd all come to a consensus view. They'd come to a pretty much good understanding of what they wanted and what they thought was the right explanation and what the right caveats were to accompany these assessments. I think it was only one we made a very minor adjudication on. So having done all of that, gone through this process, which took a couple or so months, it spits out your state and trend assessment at the bottom, which is this 5-band system. Willie Towers massively takes against the names for some of these categories, so we'll have to revise that if we do that in the future, about excellent, good, moderate, poor, and bad. But it's really about trying to say, well, where roughly are we on this spectrum and what the trend is doing. Yes, I think it comes up on there, but not here. But I think soil was one that is highlighted in the EEA report again, that was one where actually people thought there really isn't enough evidence to assess the trend. So even with expert judgment, there's not enough evidence on soils in Scotland to fully understand what's happening with soils or what is going to happen with soils. Again, something picked up very much by the EEA. So in terms of the contributions, it's really significant. It is a partnership project. It's involved people from a wide range of organisations. I can't remember how many now, but all these different topics were authored by different people from different organisations from across the piece. We had these 109, 110 experts involved in the discussions of state and trend, who are all willing to put their names to it at the end. And very fundamentally, we've got the editorial group, a couple of whom are here. I think I've demoted Des, that's Professor Des Thompson, we should congratulate on being elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, I think, last week. So Des was one of our mainstays. And this is a really important group. It's incredibly important because there's a range of skills and experience and backgrounds in the group. I think we've got around 300 odd years of experience sitting in that group, and from a really quite a wide, broad background. So they were actually incredibly interesting because for a start we were getting to dabble in peer review topics that weren't really our area, so we got to stick our nose in places, which was quite interesting in itself. But also the group and the range of different things they could bring to that was really useful. And I'll touch briefly on some suggestions of that for the future. So in terms of the lessons we learned, well, you'll remember that I talked about these, however many authors. Oops.
Wherever you are, I've always depended on the kindness. Strange.
So that's probably the key message. We've got 120 odd people that we had to try and encourage to do this. We didn't have any stick, we didn't have any mechanism to force people to take part. We had very high level agreements at director level and chief executive level that yes, this should be done. That doesn't always directly translate to getting someone to do something for you on time. So we had to do an awful lot of discussion with people to get this to happen. And it's very fitting to note that Vivian Lee is being led off to a lunatic asylum. At the end of this process, I think there are a few of us who, it was touch and go towards the last. I think one of my favourites was, I think about 4 days to go, pleading with someone, who I won't name, to please send in their final draft. Please can you send it, it's got to go live in 2 days' time. And the email came back saying, yikes, I'd better get started, which didn't do much for my blood pressure. So the whole experience was very much like herding cats. They were very pleasant cats. They'd got very good reasons for not doing it on time, but it isn't easy. And this is partly our own fault, I think. So you've got different stages of bringing people along with things. I think as the editorial group, we had a really good shared vision. We all worked very closely together. We had a really good idea of what it was we wanted to achieve, who we were trying to talk to, what the language should be, how we should set out the messages, what sort of things we should be talking about in this report. I think we then largely imposed that on the authors, and they weren't always brought along with it. So again, it varied between different individuals, but quite often we were telling them, well, we want this sort of thing, and understandably, they didn't fully understand what we wanted. However, clearly you tried to explain it again and again, and they might not agree with it because they weren't involved in setting out, well, this is a structure, this is what your topic is, this is where it sits, this is how we want you to lay it out. So I think there's a real lesson there as well. In terms of the content, there are gaps in it, and there are gaps that we would really like to fill. And the part of this comes back to gaps in the evidence and maybe gaps in understanding. So some of the things we struggled on were the links between environment and health and getting a good, clear way of laying that out. Another area was cities and towns and the urban environment is finding some individual or organisation who is comfortable leading on that and trying to pull together that range of information. So there are real gaps there, and we're not sure what the solution is to filling some of those. Over 2014, I think the editorial group and Alex Salmon were both very concerned with independence. I think we were possibly more so. It's very difficult. There's a real tension. So we had this editorial group from across organisations, and I think generally we kept each other honest very well. So we'd say, no, that's not right, and we'd challenge one another. That did work very well. But I think there is an underlying question about the independence because we're all mainly part of government agencies. And for the future, when we try to widen that, it is quite difficult. We need to think about how we do that and how we allow the State Environment Report to have room to challenge certain of these pieces of work. I think there are definitely some good ways we've thought of how we can do that, but we need to think again if we do it. There are also gaps in understanding and in ways of presenting information. So I've taken one word out, so it's not attributable to any particular organisation, but this is exactly, other than that, word for word, a sentence that came in one of the topics. Anyone like to have a stab at what that actually means? So this is written, our audience was the informed and interested member of the public. So someone said, yes, this is written for that audience. No. Well, I've de-attributed what it was in terms of the activity, but it comes down to basically, we get something from this bit of the environment. And the sentence was not easy to understand. So there's a real thing about trying to explain who we're talking to and how we're going to do it and try and set it out clearly. This comes down as another underpinning problem perhaps was communication. So this is a very obviously informed, engaged and very attractive audience. How many people here have actually heard of the Safe Environment Report up until a month ago? You could put your hand up if you knew it existed. Not too bad, so that's maybe a bit more than a third, maybe edging on towards half. But you're the half of people who've bothered to give up a day of your time to come here and listen to us talk about the Safe Environment Report. So you'd hope that we were hitting 100% here and that we're doing better than 50% in other areas. So I think we need to learn a lot about communication. Part of the problem with that is it's actually quite hard to sell the State Environment Report because by definition it's a synthesis report. There's nothing revolutionary in it. It's not presenting any brand new research. It's pulling things together to try and tell a cohesive story about the environment. But there's nothing you can really hook a news story onto. But I think there's definitely a lesson there about really how do we communicate this better. And the audience, again, I think we were clear we were talking to an informed and interested member of the audience. I hope we by and large hit that brief, but that isn't the whole world. That's a very small subset of people that we need to talk to about the environment. And we haven't gone that step further to put a veneer on top of this to take this hopefully impartial and unbiased assessment and stick something on top of it that makes it actually grabbable and more interesting and more engaging for the general public. And then this shared vision, I think, is a really important lesson for the future, that we need to collaborate more at the beginning, and rather than say this is how we're going to do it, we need to bring people together and get a shared view of how we're going to talk about the environment. Another thing that came out of that is that we did this deliberately. We set it off and we asked individual authors to write their sections, and then we spent an awful lot of time trying to bring those together to make the tone consistent. I think probably actually you need to try and get individual experts to draft their sections and then have one or two people who then pull it all together and they effectively rewrite it rather than try and get the author to write it in the right style. So that was a real thing. We thought we were saving time and effort, and actually probably took us longer and annoyed people more because you have to go backwards and forwards tweaking what they'd written. Another really important point is it's very important to have a good editorial group. There's a huge background experience, a lot of wisdom in this group, obviously, and it was really very good supportive mechanism when you're doing it. You really needed this when you're feeling particularly beaten down by it, to be able to go to people who are sharing the pain and could help you with it. And it's definitely worth highlighting Karen, who's quietly sitting there, who's done a huge amount of work on this as well, probably largely unheralded, partly because she goes to the backup photos, but she did an awful lot of work on this individually. So if we put all this together, we've got these state and trends assessments, we've got people writing topics, we're bringing together data. What we hope we've done is given the best picture of the state of Scotland's environment yet. But there is a question mark, and the whole point is it's open to challenge. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nathan. That was a good description of the process, warts and all. You can judge the final product by going on to Scotland's Environment Web and having a look at the State of the Environment report. But we've got about just under 10 minutes for any questions to Nathan about the process. Okay. So, is new or novel legislation required to help to improve the environment? And specifically, new water legislation to lead to improvement of aquatic environment. So,
we always make the statement whenever we're asked about legislation that we don't propose legislation, we provide the information, and it's up to the politicians to make legislation. But yes, I think is the answer, that we do need modern and updated legislation, including in new areas. I mentioned in my presentation, I'll give 3 very quick examples, very quick. One, I mentioned in my presentation around the subject of the circular economy. The European Commission has promised that by the end of this year it will come forward with new legislation on waste and the circular economy and resource efficiency. There was a proposal which was put forward about 18 months ago. The new Commission, which came in last November, withdrew that proposal because they said it wasn't ambitious enough. So we're looking to see that new, highly ambitious circular economy proposal by the end of this year. That's one area. On water, it's not my own specific area of expertise, but I do know that the Water Framework Directive has undergone what's called a refit evaluation, and an examination of the extent to which the Water Framework Directive is actually delivering upon the objectives that were established. And I don't know if the conclusions around the Water Framework Directive have actually been finalised yet. I don't believe they have. And the third one, and the most obvious one, is around energy and climate change. The European Union has said that just in terms of the targets for greenhouse gas emissions reductions, we have a target of 20% greenhouse gas emissions reductions by 2020. We've basically achieved that and will achieve it ahead of schedule. The European Union has decided that by 2030 we need a 40% emission reduction compared to 1990 levels. So that headline objective has been defined, but the legislation for how you actually get there is coming forward this year and next year. So before Paris, there will be the climate conference at the end of the year. There will be legislation to reform the emissions trading system. And then next year, there will be further legislation tackling agriculture, transport, and some of the non-trading sectors. So legislation is definitely still needed.
great. Thanks, Paul.
Hello, I'm Graham Russell. I'm the Planning and Environment Officer for Royal Yachting Association Scotland. I was really interested to hear about the process here. There's a lot of marine stuff going on, and I think there are a lot of lessons that can be transformed, can be taken from this process to applying in the very difficult situations we have with lots of stakeholders, lots of specialist knowledge, and how we can efficiently pull it all together.
Thank you.
It's very good. Actually, part of that fits into something we've been looking at recently. So we've done this work on defining the state. What we're next trying to look at is how effective different measures are to protect and improve the environment. And only recently I've come across a very useful, it's actually a software package that looks at multi-criteria decision making, very complex, but basically it's an incredibly good way, and it links back to this work on indicators, and through that it allows you to say, well, how much of a change do you wish to make to, say, water, and then what the impacts will be on air. So it helps you try and balance different competing demands, which is a problem across all sectors, and things like the land use strategy are trying to resolve that. But this question of how you balance different different priorities, different endpoints you want to get to is really interesting, and something we're trying to look at next time we iterate this, as to how you bring that sort of assessment process in to make it both more transparent and more flexible perhaps as to what people want their endpoints to be. So that's a really good point.
Dave Gorman again from Edinburgh University. Two thoughts, Nathan, just interested in your views. First one is, well, you are at Edinburgh University, so I would say this, when you're in the 14th ranked university in the world, we have 33,000 students and 10,000 staff. So my first thought is around the involvement of Scottish universities going forward as to whether there's more there to build in. But the second one is, I was in this building a few months back on a Sunday, feeling a bit annoyed actually because I had to do some work, and the idea was that we would expose some of our young people to some of the questions that we thought that we had to solve, some of the problems. And it was called a hackathon. For those of you under 30, you probably know what these things are. I didn't know what it was. So anyway, came in on a Sunday feeling a little bit grumpy that I was going to spend a whole day listening to what I thought might be some rather rubbish ideas, to be honest, from people who'd only just found out about the topic the day before. What we actually found was extraordinary ideas, and some of them, we have an innovation lab within the Carbon Centre in the centre of the city, and we are hoping to maybe take some of those ideas forward. And I wondered whether there's something about complementing going forward the process of expertise. You clearly need the experts, and you need people who understand these things, with some kind of youth element or some sort of prediction markets or some sort of different way of synthesizing the evidence and taking a new approach and almost comparing the two, for example. So just some thoughts.
Thank you. So Nathan, what are you going to do next time?
Okay, next trick is, so I think, yes, definitely more academic involvement in both in helping to draft and put together the topics of the State of Environment Report, and also to help with these judgments of state and trend and effectiveness of measures. And we did involve quite a few academic partners, including some from Edinburgh University. I think what we probably didn't do was trail this early enough and explain early enough what we wanted and who we wanted to get involved. So we probably lacked from getting the uptake that we were after, but we were definitely very keen to involve that. We got 102 organisations or individuals. We could have run the process with a couple of hundreds of things, so it would be good to have definitely more involvement from that side. The latter point about hackathons, I think Jo can maybe touch on briefly in her talk, putting her on the spot. But there's also has been on SE Web before, there's been a youth discussion, and Paul Griffiths is lurking, finding he's quite tall. If you spot him later on, there he is. See, I told you he was tall.
Up the corner there.
So Paul can talk a bit more about the youth discussion, but there was that work. Again, one of the aspirations, well, there are two separate aspirations we set off with. One was to aim to have, this is the state of Scotland's environment, but allow people to cut it regionally, to say, well, this is the area I'm interested in. Is there some way of cutting from that the different metrics and the different indicators and trying to present a local scaled state of the environment assessment? We tripped up on that technologically, it's very difficult, and also trying to work out scientifically how to cut your indicators up for different areas is very hard, but it's something we'd like to revisit and look at again. Another part of this was looking, again, the initial discussion was around, well, this is the state of the environment as set out by the great and the good, and this is our hopefully trustworthy and impartial assessment, then allowing space or some format for others to put their own views in about what should be done, their assessment of how well they think the state is and how well you think the policies are applying to fix that. And again, it gets very difficult, and I think to underpin all of that, what you need almost first of all is working out how you're going to communicate it and how you're going to get people involved. So what we've tended to do is put a huge amount of work into deriving, well, this is how people can get involved, and then 7 people turn up on a dog. So it's actually, we need to work out how to communicate things better and get that engagement and involvement to make it worth the investment of the infrastructure to support it. I think it's a really important point, and again, the EEA report and again in the Scottish report, it talks continually about interaction and engagement and getting people involved, and the only way we're going to fix these complex, intractable and interrelated problems is from the bottom up by engaging people, and especially the young people, in actually trying to do something about it and fundamental shifts in behaviour that are necessary. So we need to work more, and part of what SEWeb's trying to do is help bring about that shift, but it isn't easy. Otherwise we'd have done it already.